All right, we are live on YouTube and we are live on Zoom.
Welcome to the Summer 2021 K-12 Teaching Academy. We will begin soon, but in the meantime, go ahead and feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and make sure that it's sent to all panelists and attendees. Welcome. Welcome to our attendees to the Summer 2021 K-12 Teaching Academy. Go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. We will begin soon. We are so glad you're here today. Welcome, Kate. Happy Wednesday to you, Gay. Excellent. Welcome to those of you just joining us. This is the Summer 2021 K-12 Teaching Academy put on by the Lurie College of Education here at San Jose State. Please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat and address it to all panelists and attendees. Hi again, Armin. Good to see you back. Welcome to everyone here today. Welcome, Chris. Good to have you here. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a moment with just a couple of announcements, but do make sure that your chat is sent to or is set to all panelists and attendees so that when we're participating in the webinar today, your comments will be able to be seen by both the panelists and our other attendees. Hi, Tabitha. Good to have you here. All right, let's get started with just a couple of housekeeping announcements before we get onto our presentation today. A recording of this event will be made available after the presentation today on the K-12 Academy website. If you would like captions today, you just go down to the very bottom of your Zoom screen and click on live transcription, and those will be provided for you. They will also be on the recording. Just a quick reminder that this is a traditional webinar format, so your video and audio have been turned off automatically, but please do use the chat to communicate with the panelists and also the attendees. And just a quick little plug for our Lurie College of Education Facebook and LinkedIn group. There is a link right there in the chat. Thank you, Brian. And this is just a really great way to keep on top of all the amazing resources that the Lurie College of Education puts out for educators and people involved in education. we are going to go ahead and get started. Our presentation today is called Freedom Dreaming, Ethnic Studies Teaching in the Secondary Grades. And we are fortunate enough to have a panel of really amazing presenters today. So we have Julia Duggs, who is an Ethnic Studies teacher resident from the Lurie College of Education here at San Jose State. We have Dr. Victoria Duran, a social science teacher from Overfelt High School. We have Dr. Marcos Pizarro, an associate dean here at the Lurie College of Education at San Jose State. And then we also have Dr. Luis Poza, an assistant professor, also here at the Lurie College of Education. Thank you all so much for being here today. We are really, really fortunate and excited to have you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for the slides, but I will turn it over to our amazing presenters.
All right. Thank you, Becca, for that introduction. Thank you as well to Brian Chamduli, doing amazing work behind the scenes for this tech platform, and it is an honor to be with you all this afternoon. As Becca mentioned, I'm Luis Poza, I'm an assistant professor in the College of Education at San Jose State. And it's my privilege to introduce my colleague, Marcos Pizarro, who will be leading us off as we discuss freedom dreaming, ethnic studies teaching in the secondary grades.
Cool, can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes, we hear you, Marcos.
Sorry, I'm having Wi-Fi issues, so Luis is gonna jump in if you all lose me at any time. Yeah, so just super excited to be with you all today. And so grateful that you are able to spend this time with us. We've got a lot that we're trying to share with you all. So we're going to just do our best to do it in a quick manner, and then process with you in the Q&A, right? So, you know, the first thing that we want you to maybe know is just who we are, right? So we're this team of folks that have come together through our work at Overfelt High School and come at this from different levels, and you'll get a chance to kind of explain that. What we're going to do is not do this interactive because it is a webinar, right? So we're just going to kind of come at you and hit you with everything we got, and then use the Q&A as a chance to try and unpack that. So that's going to be where we get into the dialogue. But we can respond to questions in the chat. We will respond to them in the chat. So we're not going to necessarily mess with our flow, but we're going to do it in that way. Yeah, so let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to do a quick introduction of myself in this way. That is a picture of my 6th grade class at Oak Street Elementary, where I first was an elementary school teacher, and I learned so much through those young people. I learned about the power and the possibility of community. I learned about the ways in which injustice and oppression look in the faces and lives and experiences of young 11 and 12-year-olds. And I also learned so much hope and possibility and power and yeah, just collective strength through that. And so that's my inroads to ethnic studies. That's how I've learned ethnic studies. And I just wanted to share a bit about that before we start. So that's me. And let's go to the next.
And unfortunately, it seems we've lost Marcos a little bit there, so I'll jump in until we can get him back. But so the first piece is just an overview of the slide on the history of ethnic studies. So Becca, if you
yeah.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Marcos.
Oh, man.
Sorry. You know, ethnic studies is very recently in news and debates and everything. Kind of comes in iterative cycles. Seems every 20 years or so there's a battle. But what's really important is that ethnic studies is a long-standing discipline in its own right. So 50 years old, dating back to the late 60s to student activism at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley, as well as the high school blowouts and walkouts in East LA in the 1960s, right, for demands for more culturally relevant curriculum, right? And then ethnic studies disciplines as practices, sort of absent the name and the title, were being built long before this. Becca, if you don't mind clicking a couple more times, please. Right. Certainly for a long time, we've had authors writing and speaking about the importance of students, particularly students of color and communities of color, being represented and uplifted within schooling experiences and curriculum. And these practices of teaching, as you'll see, have been implemented in K-12 settings for decades, even before the specific labels of ethnic studies were there. It seems we have Marcos back, so Marcos, feel free to take back.
Thanks, Luis. Let's go to the next slide. I think Luis got it from what I heard. And go ahead and scroll through. There we go. So what ethnic studies has been is it's been a challenge to kind of traditional disciplines, right? And it's been a form of resistance. We're going to look at what ethnic studies is in multiple different ways. But one piece has been resistance, right? Traditional disciplines were used explicitly to subjugate communities of color in very intentional and later more kind of covert and subtle ways. And so ethnic studies has been a response to that, and it is challenging those disciplines about their kind of implicit and explicit ways of reinforcing white supremacy. Keep it going, Becca. I think there might be one more bullet on this slide. Yeah. So just like the whole notion of objectivity, right, is one way that we have to push back, because objectivity is actually used as a way of normalizing whiteness and decentering communities of color, right? And so we are challenging and pushing back on that. And that requires really rigorous intellectual approaches, theoretically and methodologically, which is real exciting. I can go on forever about that. So I'm just going to move to the next slide. So the traditional kind of like emphasis of the areas of ethnic studies have been around the African American and Black studies, American Indian, Native American studies, API studies, and Chicanx, Latinx studies. And in addition, there's been the comparative ethnic studies, like looking at those groups across all those different arenas. But I want to just emphasize that each of these disciplines is unique, right? It comes from different forms of knowledge, production from generations of wisdom and ways of knowing and ways of being within communities that really need to be explored distinctly, right? In addition, the next bullet there kind of just highlights the fact that we've expanded these definitions of ethnic studies. And so there's been critical mixed race studies, Muslim American and Arab American studies, as well as race and resistance studies. And I just want to note that, a lot of the work in ethnic studies has been aligned with those communities that have faced different forms of land dispossession. And so the Palestinian community is one that we've been aligned with in ethnic studies, and that has led to some controversy. I'm not going to get into that now, but I just want to acknowledge it because it's real, and it's one of the important areas for debate and discussion as we think about ethnic studies moving forward. So let's go to the next slide. So ethnic studies is going to take on white supremacy for sure. And you already know that. So what I want to highlight is that second bullet, right? Is like we center the assets, the funds of knowledge, the cultural wealth of communities of color. It's really important not to just look at ethnic studies as the study of oppression. It's the study of surviving, of resisting, of thriving despite oppression, right? And what we see in our communities, what we see in our young people is just phenomenal. Perseverance, but also just like creativity. And so we want to be able to highlight both of that. And Victoria and Julie are going to talk more about that. So let's go to the next slide. I want to reference critical race theory because it is such a controversy right now, right? People are talking about it, and they're talking about it because they don't understand what critical race theory is. But it comes from the law, from critical legal studies, right? And wanting to understand the law and recognizing that the only way to understand the law is by looking at it through the eyes of those who have been most dispossessed. And so what our work does is we look at that and we take on these race evasive approaches. I want to push back on the use of colorblind language for multiple reasons, right? But we think about these as race evasive approaches where they're ignoring the realities of systemic racism. And in CRT, we use concrete data. This is not made up stuff. This is using historical analysis along with contemporary analysis to understand the way in which our society functions at its core. Next one. And so CRT, it's very similar to what we just described with ethnic studies. It centers the experiences, insights, and wisdom of BIPOC communities, right? And think about the Black Lives Matter approach, right? And what Black Lives Matter is saying until we center Black lives mattering, we are not addressing systemic inequality. And whether we're in communities that include large numbers of African Americans or few or none, it's our responsibility to center the Black Lives Matter movement and to understand that we have historically as a society say Black lives don't matter, right? And so we need to push back and fight back against that. Next. So there's a bunch of literature, and I'm actually going to kind of skip over this slide because there's a bunch of literature that we could talk about that looks through all the different things, like ethnic studies, like the research. So this book by Slater and Zavala highlights all of the research that says these are all the things that ethnic studies does, right? And it's really powerful. And Julia and Victoria can kind of show you a little bit more about that. So let's go to the next one. But I think what we don't want to forget is we don't want to forget that ethnic studies also leads to greater student attendance, right? It leads to higher GPAs. It leads to greater college going readiness, but it has phenomenal impacts for our young people, right? And so, I mean, I know this from having taught ethnic studies at one of our local high schools here in San Jose. It's unbelievable what it does. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So, this is my last slide. Whoops, a little too far. But this is the most important slide that I wanted to share, because what ethnic studies is it's not content, right? It is content, but that's not the most important thing of ethnic studies. It reflects an ethos, right? A transformative ethos that is committed to supporting, uplifting, and helping our BIPOC communities thrive, right? And it's about justice, it's about freedom, and it's about joy, but it's about that ethos. Like, you have to have an ethical commitment to these principles if you're going to be about ethnic studies. And that is linked to commitments, right? These commitments, we have a commitment. Like, if you're teaching ethnic studies, you have a commitment to meaningful, radical, and justice-centered relationships with students, with families, with communities, with colleagues. Like, that's what we're about. We're about building those relationships. That's the most important thing to me, to ethnic studies, because we can freedom dream.
I think we just lost Marcos as he was about to deliver his dramatic closing. So hopefully we'll get him back shortly, but I can pick up then. And so again, the purpose of these ethnic studies practices is, underlying these beneficial effects from the research that Marcos has cited is an ethos, right? Is an ethical commitment and a series of principles and beliefs in our students, beliefs in their communities, right? Willingness on our part as educators to reflect and empower, right? And to let students step into their own power, right? As agents and as learners and as knowledge holders. So those commitments have to be there in order for the practices to live up to that. And so, Becca, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. And so, again, I'm Luis Posa, and I'm going to be sharing a little bit about sort of these specifically these principles and then the characteristics of ethnic studies pedagogies. And I'll do that with some brief examples of curriculum structures that are common to ethnic studies classes. But by way of demonstrating some of these principles, I'd like to start with a poem by Luis Valdez called Inakech that you'll often see as part of student community building and goal setting in particularly Chicanx studies classes, Latinx studies classes. So Becca, you mind playing a little bit of the video there, please?
Tú eres mi otro yo.
Tú eres mi otro yo.
You are my other me.
You are my other me.
Si te hago daño a ti.
Si te hago daño a ti.
If I do harm to you.
If I do harm to you.
Me hago daño a mí mismo.
Me hago daño a mí mismo.
I do harm to myself.
I do harm to myself.
Si te amo.
Yeah, so this is a poem that beautifully captures, right, the spirit of mutualism, community, and collectivism that underlies ethnic studies teaching, right? So counter to a lot of the criticism being launched about ethnic studies and critical race theory, right? These are not pedagogies of division. These are pedagogies of humanization, right? Of finding that shared humanity across us. But in order to really amplify that shared humanity, we do have to uplift, right, the joy, the power of some of the voices and perspectives that have been historically silenced and marginalized. So on to the next slide, please. So Christine Sleater and Miguel Zavala, again, they identify 7 hallmarks of ethnic studies pedagogies, right? So curriculum as counter-narrative aligned with criticality means that an ethnic studies curriculum, right, really centers the perspectives of people of color, and it does it in a way that analyzes structurally unjust systems of power, right, with the goal of dismantling them. Right. It also has a clear focus on identity, right? So a reclaiming of cultural identities, as Marcos noted, right? Very often curriculum, especially in context of colonization, right, has been about suppressing particular identity characteristics, belief systems. We've seen in the news, right, the really just horrible, tragic Indigenous education experiences being unearthed in Canadian schools, right, that we know were the same in the US as well, right? So ethnic studies is an opportunity to reclaim those cultural identities, right, to assert that voice and that presence and that belonging, that humanity, right? While also attending to intersectionality and multiplicity, right? Acknowledging that our identities are not monolithic, right? That we're not defined by one single identity characteristic, right? But that we have overlapping identities and complementary identities. Ethnic studies pedagogies are community engaged and they are culturally responsive and mediated, right? That means that students are not, their learning is not siloed in the classroom or in the subject area, right? It is very rooted to their lived experiences, the experiences of their families, their neighbors, their ancestors, things like that. And students, this is really pivotal, are positioned as intellectuals, as creative, agentive beings, right? With the power to make change and to analyze deeply on the factors that will guide that change. So next slide, please. So just by way of exemplifying some of these hallmarks in practice, I'm going to go very quickly through 4 curriculum instances that you might often see in ethnic studies classrooms, right? The first is what in Latinx studies classes is called testimonio, right? It comes from the tradition of counterstories and critical race theory. In Filipinic studies, right, Asian American Pacific Islander studies, you have the cuento, right? But really what this is students telling their own stories and starting from their own stories as a basis to analyze, to place themselves within historical narratives and socio-political narratives, and to understand the ways that power and systems have shaped their own experiences, their community's experiences, and then in turn, how they can act on those structures and institutions. So next slide, please. This is an example. It's a digital story testimonio. It's a poem written by a student at UC Davis, part of the Humanizing Deportation Digital Stories project, talking about sort of the experience of getting calling cards to speak with her family that had been deported across the border. So Becca, if you don't mind playing just the first 30 seconds or so of this video, please.
Calling cards. 1. Across oceans and land, working to connect one phone line with another. Like an umbilical cord, these 5, 10, 20 square cards are more than plastic. These calling cards have heartbeats. 2. We survived through phone lines, a cycle of dialing number. On the other line waited abuela. On the other line waited memories. On the other line waited birthday wishes that should have been given in person while eating guava cake. Thank you. All right. So, and as has been mentioned, you all will have these slides, so you can check out this full video as well. And I certainly recommend the Humanizing Deportation portal as a powerful example of testimonial. And so, again, this is a chance for students to engage in rigorous academic work, right? They are crafting these pieces, right? They are revising them, reviewing them. What is your aim? What is your audience, right? They're doing rigorous intellectual work, right? But they're also centering themselves and their communities, and they're understanding their own experience in the light of larger political systems, colonial systems, what have you. Next slide, please. Another very frequent practice, and again, these practices are not limited to ethnic studies classes, as we'll share a little more, but is what's called Youth Participatory Action Research, or Teacher-Student Participatory Action Research, right, or YPAR for short, right? And so in YPAR, students take the lead identifying issues of concern,
right? This can even start from testimonio, right? Students can rehash their lived experience and identify like, wow, this is something that I really wish my family didn't have to go through. What's at the heart of this, right? What are the systems that are underlying this? They gain some initial background knowledge. They read, they do research, they conduct interviews, and I'll share some examples about that. They'll generate some research questions to address what lingering doubts they might still have after their initial reading, right? And they'll select some methods to answer those questions, right? So maybe they need to do more community interviews. Maybe they need to take some sort of action, right? And so this is all in the context of action inquiry. That's what the A and Y part, right? Is that they're actually doing something to address the issue that they've identified. And as they take that action, they're collecting and analyzing data, right? So what changes do we see? What, what observations do we make about our process working as a collective to address injustice, right? And what can we learn from that? And then they disseminate the findings and they reflect on that, right? Have they solved the problem or do they need to continue? Next slide, please. So here's an example of YPAR from classroom research that I was engaged in. So this was a middle school, there's a social studies class, not an ethnic studies class. But so as part of the social studies curriculum, students had to learn about westward expansion, right, and manifest destiny as a period in history. So this was a teacher who had been educated on kind of ethnic studies pedagogies and student-centered pedagogies more broadly. So wanted to incorporate this, and noting that the students themselves had made some associations between westward expansion and settler colonialism to current trends of gentrification in the city where this research took place, the teacher really wanted to honor that, right? So he invited students to really think about, okay, so what are the similarities and differences between settler colonialism, westward expansion, and current gentrification? Students were exposed to sort of myriad sources, right? They looked at primary sources. So, right, Andrew Jackson's address to Congress called, quote, On Indian Removal, a letter from Sitting Bull. They looked at artwork like John Gast's American Progress, pictured in the left corner of the slide, a video installation called Destiny's Manifest that is obviously a very kind of critical and dystopian lens around that, and that's a video installation as well. Students conducted community interviews as pictured in sort of the lower right to understand different residents' experiences with gentrification. And they worked in groups reading, going through social media, going through journalism and things like that to learn about gentrification as well. So next slide, please. So I'll also note that, social studies in the school was supposed to be taught in English, but the teacher really gave that freedom for students to draw on their bilingual repertoires, right, to engage with their bilingual communities, right, and to understand that. And so students, as part of this project, you see sort of the rubric or a section of the rubric in the left corner, right? They have to show that they gained some background information, that they did some analytical work, understanding westward expansion from the different perspectives of parties involved, right? That they understood gentrification from the perspectives of different parties involved, and putting forth some action steps as well. And then they shared this, right, with they interviewed city council members, school district officials, teachers, parents, things like that. And so they shared these results with the people they had interviewed, with their peers, things like that. And I'll also add that part of this, students shared their own testimonios of housing insecurity, displacement, things like that. So it was a very powerful unit that incorporated multiple of these pedagogical arrangements. So that's an example of YPAR in practice. Next slide, please. A third curriculum arrangement is what's called culture circles. And so these were the ideation of Paulo Freire, who worked with agricultural workers in Brazil, adults, in the 1970s, right, 60s and 70s, right? It's very similar to the concept of freedom schools in the US, right, where adults were taught literacy, right, as a way to access their voting rights. So Paulo Freire worked with agricultural workers to help them understand sort of their land rights and their labor rights in the context of dictatorial Brazil and this very sort of colonist model of labor. And so it starts with problem posing, right? You've noticed by now that this is a common trend in ethnic studies pedagogies, right? As we draw from our experience, we draw from our observations, and we identify issues of injustice, right? And so students generate a theme, and then they come up with an image or an artifact aligned with that theme. They have small group discussion where they unpack that theme and connect it to kind of its concrete instantiations. In those same small groups, they dialogically consider how the problem might be addressed from its root causes. And then they plan and take action and reflect upon that action. So next slide, please. This is an example from Mariana Soto-Manning's work, Freire Teaching and Learning. And so Mariana Soto-Manning was a doctoral student under Paulo Freire, who has now become, right, a critical pedagogue, strong in her own right. But so, students started with this image on the left, right? Well, I'll skip some of the analysis, right? But school as assembly line, some people thrive, some don't, right? And what have you, right? But it starts with this very literal level description, right? What are we looking at, literally? No inference kind of thing. Then a first analysis where we start to get into some inferences, right? What could the author be suggesting, right? Intimating? What are some of the real life connections, right? The embodiments of this theme that's being brought and some of the related problems. What are its root causes and what action can we take? And so the small groups are working through this process dialogically in culture circles. And so again, you see this very rigorous academic work, right? Of research, of making connections, of seeing multiple perspectives, of envisioning and taking action. Next slide, please. Sorry, I have my daughter here with me. Right. A fourth instance.
Yes, Luis.
Yes, I may be called to wipe a bottom in a second. Sorry. Okay. A fourth example is what's called theater of the oppressed. And so this was theorized by Augusto Boal, and it follows a very similar process. But now instead of looking at sort of a visual representation of an issue, students are actually enacting it, right? So students are writing scripts, right? They're identifying issues and asking questions, and then they're presenting it. Now, what's special about the performances in Theater of the Oppressed are two particular roles. One is called the joker or the jester. And this is sort of a narrator of sorts, someone who sets up the performance, who gives some questions, some interaction, can kind of encourage and stimulate the audience a little bit. And then the second is the spectator, right? Distinct from spectator. But so the spectator is the audience, the spectators, but they're called spectators because in the second performance of the show, they are encouraged by the joker, or if they are so moved on their own, right, to step in, right, to jump into the scene and to change it. Right, to think about how could this action be done differently in a way that would sort of subvert the interactive oppression that is happening in this moment, right? So that's a key difference. Next slide, please. Right, so we have here just a short little clip of a workshop around Theater of the Oppressed. For the sake of time, I don't think we will go into this one. But it is the process that I just described, right? Where students are, rigorously learning about an issue, thinking about how to perform it so that their audience understands it, right? And then also thinking of ways to encourage the audience to jump in and take a sort of reforming action around the injustice. Next slide, please. So as you see, Theater of the Oppressed follows this similar sequence as the other pedagogies that we've seen, right? So it's students taking the lead, drawing from their own experiences, their community knowledge, right? And further research that they conduct to identify those issues, right? Then conveying that issue to an audience, right? To perform it and apply it, and to start to envision what corrective action would look like. And then from the analysis of the performance, including the spectators' interventions, right, when they deviated from the initial performance, right, they can analyze the paths forward, right, and reflect and guide. So next slide. So I just wanted to come back to these 7 hallmarks of ethnic studies pedagogies, right? And suggest, these 4 curriculum arrangements And I know that I really rushed through them. Again, we have not only these slides available to you, but a resources slide that points you in the direction of how to implement some of these practices in classrooms, right? You can see how they embody a number, if not all of these principles, right? So by drawing from students' experiences, by centering students' curiosity and agency, right? And by encouraging students to take action within their community, we're really attending to, right, that empowerment for students, right? And we're really highlighting, yes, we are starting from moments of injustice, right? But because we are letting students leverage their own strengths and leverage their community's strengths, we're also letting them sort of reclaim their cultural identities and highlight the joy and power in their communities, right? And so with that, I will hand it over to Victoria and Julia for a more in-depth example of classroom ethnic studies practices.
Thanks, Luis. Seems like that was just in time.
Thank you, Luis. And I really, just want to bring in that it's through this practice and what June Jordan offers here. I know of nothing more important, more difficult, and more purely loving than the nurture of children, be it as a parent, a teacher, or as an artist wishing to serve them well. And so, Luis, I don't take lightly that, you are sharing this and also offering and extending the caregiving of your young one with you. And so this was from Parenting for Liberation. And this speaks to me in the multiple identities and ways that I show up within the classroom. And for me, my name is Dr. Victoria Isabel Duran. I'm in my 13th year of teaching in East San Jose. I identify as a Chicana, Mama scholar. I am a caregiver and to my 3 beloved Black and Brown children. And I am raising them in a world and also teaching young people in a world where they become influential within the realities that my children are living in. And so I often tell my students, like, you are going to be the elders of my children. And what does that then mean? And bringing back through this ethic of care. And I also would like to extend that, in my experience in teaching, also situated in the community that raised me. And so there's a big reciprocity and regard in that ethic. And so I'm really excited to share a bit of my experience in teaching ethnic studies, and particularly in this year in pandemic, in virtual teaching, during a racial insurgence, right? And all of the complexities and nuances that were there pre-pandemic and now. And also moving from a isolation of teaching also to collaboratively teaching within this residency program with Julia Duggs, and the creative processing and that teaching also as healing. And so we'll be speaking more to that shortly. But if Becca, you can click to the next question that has often come up for me. And I'll share a bit of a story around this, is that a few years back, I had a student, her name was Genevieve, tall, influential. She had the swagger. She was on the basketball team. And Genevieve was chilling in class one day, just kind of soaking in what I was teaching. I can't remember the lesson. But one day she said, Duran, you use a lot of that like intellectual language, all of those like big words that we don't understand. And so that brought me to this question by Erykah Badu. What good do your words do if they can't understand you? And that I really had to ruminate and sit with that question, that I became that teacher that became like this, using this language that students were, there was a disconnect, right? And so although my intentions well-meaning and expressing language, and also there was that bridge. And what is that bridge? And so really holding gratitude for the accountability that Genevieve brought me to think about. I'd also offer that in cultivating a classroom with ethnic studies frameworks and pedagogies, it's also about thinking about the fullness of who students are when they step into the classroom. And so with that, I bring it to the next question. So if you click one more time. What good does school do if students are expected to leave parts of their identity and culture at home? So if schools become sites of performance, performing and adhering to what a teacher's expectation of you and your identity when you walk into a classroom. And you do that 6 times a day within the high school. Or, you do that and, just kind of navigating, like, I can be this identity with my friends, this identity with my teachers, this identity at home. It becomes tailoring. And so how do we begin to approach teaching in a way that students can bring their fullness of themselves, of who they are, and not compartmentalize? And so if you'd click one more time, here are some of the challenges that, and intentional practices and moving away from, because teaching ethnic studies is a subversive act. And education for liberation, to subvert schooling and the practices of schooling as it has been, to normalize and create students who listen and abide by the rules without question. So really centering an intention and a purpose over a productivity. In addition to that, bringing forth with students the integrity and the dignity, again, building on that humanizing spaces. And so in addition to that, how do we co-construct this learning space with students, because they bring in these knowledges and these ways of knowing and being in the world, because they are actively in the real world now. Oftentimes it's thought of, how do we prepare for students to be in the real world when they graduate? They're in the real world now, and they have these lived experiences that can inform and support each other as peers in a way that me offering, advice or lessons as a teacher does not have that same impact for them to learn from each other in that way. And then also through that ethic of care. And I do want to honor that Julia has really brought this into the classroom and developing it in a place of empathy and skill, and really cultivating this in ways that students can see this across their agency. And we're going to share a bit about what that looks like within a digital space. So if you'd click again, please. All right. So Alice Walker has also been really key in thinking about the dreaming, and also looking closely of the present we are in and we are constructing. It should look like the future we are dreaming. And so in doing that, as a dreamer and well-intentioned, and I'm a double Pisces, and so I can stay stuck in my dream world, but I also have to be reminded. And I think Julia's Virgo tendencies help bring that forward, and having your feet planted and taking action and doing that action alongside students is really powerful. And so in doing that, we also think of classroom management, right? And classroom management looks like as this practice and bringing forth that ethic of care. And Carla Shalaby offers refusing classroom management as the practice of care refuses the idea that our work with young children is always about preparing them for the future, and instead recognizes that children can and do exercise their power already, acting and impacting the world in daily life. We can affect the ways that they use their power by teaching them the values of interdependence and collective care. That is really the spirit when thinking of ethnic studies pedagogies, ethnic studies as a liberatory space for what students can create with each other. And that is also why ethnic studies look so different from school to school, teacher to teacher, and from period to period, because it's also holding and rooting true to the needs of students within that particular class. And so again, bringing forth that ethic of care. And within this, really leaning on the community cultural wealth by Tarayoso also supports, bringing that within the ethic of cultural knowledge, students bringing in and relying in their linguistic knowledge and their wealth and this abundance, again, that students bring in. And so if I care for you, I care for the identities that you bring in with you. And if we go to the next slide, please. And in that care during a pandemic, particularly, it's also the reciprocity of asking about student voice and feedback. So when students were asked, what was this like learning virtually? across 6 periods a day, or, throughout their teaching load or learning load. Students said, it's really stressful. Sometimes it's overwhelming, and, teachers are not aware of the impact in our home lives. And if you'd click again, please. This also was an invitation to learn about their struggles and responsibilities. The student here offers, teachers need to know that we have our own struggles and responsibilities outside of school, more especially now, and know that we are at home all day, every day. For example, personally, I've been stressing about finals, and I have a teacher who doesn't want to explain the final to me. So then reading these responses from students also who are supporting their younger siblings in their own distance learning lessons, caring for elders, there's this intergenerational experience that's occurring. There is this intimacy of learning within the home and still being expected to produce and still holding the integrity of what it means to have like this critical engagement of learning and thinking about what that then is informing the purpose of homework. So if you click again a couple times. And one more time. Second. This would be then an invitation for homework as an extension to what we are learning within the class across content, providing space for student choice, offering creative outlets for students to be able to think about what is personalized within their learning. And this also comes from the pedagogies of the home by Dolores Delgado Bernal, who shares pedagogies of the home defines it as the communication practices and learning that occur in the home and community and serve as a cultural knowledge base, right? And so what is occurring in their home is informing how students, through their lens, right, of how they see the world. So if you'd click one more time, that also informs the lessons, and this is an invitation for homework around Dia de los Muertos and also grief. We had a lesson and a unit where we explored these themes and also, again, situating the learning as spaces for healing, because the amount of grief, we are in a district, I'm in a district that was one of the first and the hardest hit with COVID, knowing that students were heavily processing grief and may not have had a space or outlet to speak about it, process it. Some of the extensions for homework became extending, virtually checking out Chicago Museum and the historical analysis of COVID and creating altares, or having a conversation with an elder and their family, or watching Coco and processing with a younger member of their family. So there is a variety of invitations here, and also an opportunity for processing in this self-reflection. And if you click again, please. So with that, thinking about the intentional, purposeful invitations to students and the work that we're asking them, and really inviting them, right? Through the ethic of consent, and centering students in their learning, in co-constructing, and also sharing new ways of learning. So this took root in the form of inviting students across a variety of playlists, mixtapes, identity visual projects that you can see here. Also as a way for students to practice and honor their various expressions and to hold and root ethnic studies frameworks. And so now I'm going to be passing the mic along to a recent San Jose State University graduate and co-teacher, Julia Duggs, who offers her beautiful framework.
Right. Hey, everybody. So today I want to introduce to you the Freedom Dreaming Journal, which is something that we used last school year with students. And it's a collection of 15 activities and reflections to really engage with and reconnect with students' familial, community, and ancestral knowledge. The word freedom dreaming itself is rooted in the intellectual legacies of Black queer feminist women like Bettina Love, who writes, "Freedom dreaming is imagining worlds that are just, representing people's full humanity, centering people left on the edges, thriving in solidarity with folks from different identities who have struggled together for justice, and knowing that dreams are just around the corner with the might of people power." So moving forward, freedom dreaming, as much as it is a skill to be cultivated, is definitely a gift. If you want to go to the next slide, that students have. So I would say that Victoria Magana, a high school student in East Side, is definitely has the gift of freedom dreaming. She writes, "Our dreams sprout from when we are children, and in order for our dreams to be accomplished, we have to keep dreaming and not give up our hope," right? So she's informing us that, there is this really strong connection between dreaming and one sense of hope, right? And so, some students walk in the door, with this gift, but it's also a skill to be, co-cultivated with students. And that's definitely the intention of the Freedom Dreaming Journal. You can go ahead. And this journal didn't come out of nowhere. There's definitely several different theories that inform it. One of them being collective cultural perpetuity, which is like the what students are engaging with, like the content. And then that within itself is informed by Yoso's community cultural wealth model, as well as the Blackfoot Nation's beliefs about cultural perpetuity. I won't get into detail with those two theories, but they're a part of the references that y'all can check out later. The second one is, homework with emphasis on home, which Victoria had just mentioned. And that's kind of like how these activities are formatted in the journal. And last, there's Lainui's 5 processes of decolonization, which is the why, like why students are doing what they're doing, the bigger picture behind the journal. So getting started with collective cultural perpetuity, it's an assets-based framework that is designed to guide students in remembering, recognizing, affirming, and passing on their familial, community, and ancestral knowledge, right? Those 3 really big pillars. Awareness of those intergenerational strengths supports students in their growth as learners as they use those strengths as a foundation for learning new ideas and skills. So there's all these different types of knowledge. And if you move forward 1 click, collective cultural perpetuity is just basically telling students like everything you need is already within you, right? You are so full of knowledge, let's work together and I want to help you grow in the ways that you seek to grow. Right. So it's the rejecting deficit thinking about students. You can leave that behind in 2020. We don't need to carry it with us into 2021. And if you move forward, click just 1 time, I think. There's a couple of examples of like the amazing kind of like conversations you can have with students about their familial, community, and ancestral knowledge. So one example within the theme of community survivance, or like how students navigate their community, how they survive, how they resist, like how they learn those things. One student writes, "My family always told me, don't be ashamed, mija. Some people are ashamed to live in brown skin, but don't know the blood they carry or the history of what makes them who they are." And so when I read this, like I read this in students' work, I can tell that this student already has a lot of knowledge about radical self-love, that they can think critically about their own identity. And that makes them a mentor for other students who are still on their own, radical self-love healing journey. So there's many, many more examples if you click forward that you can read through later. But really, like when you engage with students in these conversations, like I get the insight about students and like being able to collaborate them with their learning, but then they also gain a lot of self-awareness about what assets that they have from their home, from their family and their community that they can then bring into the classroom, right, to continue learning and growing. All right, so then the last theory before we look into a piece of student work, because I hope we have time to do that, is Lainui's 5 processes of decolonization, also the why. So there's all these 5 processes, or I like to call them practices, like as thinking about, remembering, mourning, dreaming, commitment, and action as skills. And you might be wondering, like, why are we talking about decolonization? Well, colonization is an ongoing process, right? It has to be reinforced. It has to be maintained through structures, ideologies, institutions, right? So it's not just an event that happened 500 years ago. And I think a common theme that we saw through each of our sections is that schools historically have been sites of cultural assimilation, and assimilation is a major force of colonization, right? So decolonization is the intervention, it is the disruption. So seeing things from this perspective, when you practice decolonization at the personal level, I define decolonization as a way of coming home to yourself, right? It's an act of freedom dreaming itself, right? So on one hand, decolonizing practices are also healing practices as well. So mending the relationship that you have with yourself, right, is healing, thinking about radical self-love, mending the relationships you have with your family through decolonization, because you're no longer ashamed of who they are, where they come from, what they do. And then also healing the connections that you have with your ancestors, being aware of the legacies and the generations that came before you, and like, what were their stories, their counter stories, what were their dreams, and thinking about those things. So if we move forward, I can, define each of these practices, these decolonizing practices, and demonstrate that they are also healing practices. So, remembering your ancestors, their counter stories, and finding who you really are is healing. You can go ahead and move forward. Mourning personal and collective grief, the losses and ruptures we experience, as well as intergenerational trauma, is healing. Dreaming of pathways to collective liberation and imagining what a community that is cared for looks like is healing. Commitment to your people, the greater collective, and what you stand for, right? Like your values, is healing. And last but not least, action that honors the dignity of your community and a collective vision of freedom is healing. And so if we move to the next slide, we can finally get into like what an example looks like what does this journal really look like? So there's 5 sections. Each section is based off of a decolonizing practice. So this one so happens to be dreaming. Each section contains or is introduced by a quote and a song with some lyrics, just to kind of like get students in the theme or in the zone for reflecting around dreaming. So this one so happens to be defined by Thalia Lujan, which is a student in Eastside. And again, she's making this connection between dreaming and hope. And, that's a very consistent theme. For this particular activity, it's called deprogramming. It says these reflection questions are offered by the NAT Ministry, Trisha Hersey, to encourage you to imagine a new way of living in community with each other. The possibilities are limitless as you respond to questions that are essentially asking you, what do you want? So if you move forward, we can see some of the questions and students' responses. So one question is, when do you feel most liberated or free? The student writes, I feel most liberated or free when I'm with my family because there's no need to hide who I am or have to impress anyone. One more. When do you feel most loved? I feel most loved when I'm with my mom because she's my best friend and there's nothing like her comfortness. And one more. What would a community that is cared for look like? A community that is cared for would look like clean freeways, streets, walkable places to go to. Also, everyone would greet people when they enter or meet, right? This is a freshman student in Eastside writing these reflections, dreaming and deprogramming. And now I'd like to pass the mic back to, the three of y'all to, provide some commentary for this, piece of work, what you're seeing, shower the student with flowers. Pass it over.
I just want to extend, students have it within them. And there are these experiences that suppress these truths sometimes. And when they step into spaces and people who believe in them, see that worthiness within them and pour into that they will share that. And we have some of our students who are disruptors who come in ready to share with the world. And so having space and to see their vision of what community looks like, that's a dream. And we're going to continue. One of our mentors, Adriana Garcia Cabrera, had offered that you give that dream legs to bring it into fruition. And so I just really love that students, this comes from student voice and they can imagine it, they can feel it, that it's from within them. And it also provides space from thinking of the individual to the collective when they begin to share. Because when they practice that vulnerability and that courageousness to share their truth, it also inspires for others to do the same.
Thanks, Victoria. Thanks, Julia. I just wanted to emphasize this point that Julia was a first, not even first year teacher. And just to say that what that means is like all of us can do all of this work, right? Regardless of what our level of experience is. So that's super exciting. I think I might have froze again.
Yeah, we heard you, Chris. Yeah, so I'll jump in as well and connect also to the slide that's here now, right? So that's in front of us, right? And so again, certainly throw flowers for the students whose work Julia just shared, for Julia and Victoria for embodying those hallmarks of ethnic studies pedagogies, right? That really decentering of their own authority and sort of that opening the doors for students to guide their learning and to reflect deeply on their experiences and on what motivates them for their learning, and deploying sort of their abilities toward that those broader goals. And so I think, and I also, I wish we had more time and more kind of permissions and everything so that you all could see like a student's whole journal, because what Julia was able to share were kind of snippets from students' work, and really the whole is so much more than the sum of its parts. And if you see the ways that students have integrated, recipes that they discussed with family elders, along with reflections on, playing dominoes with family, along with playlists that they assembled that helped them process grief, along with reflections on on COVID and the ways that that it was disproportionately and unjustly impacting their communities, right? Seeing that all come together captures not only the humanization that was taking place in the classroom, but really the depth of thought and analysis as well, right? And so just a really powerful exercise, and I'm so grateful to Julia for bringing it to us today and for guiding students, facilitating students' experience through it. And then
one more thought.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that what Julia and Victoria show is like the embodiment of this transformative ethnic studies ethic and commitment that I was talking about earlier. She cares about these young people. They both care about these young people and their holistic well-being. And that's what our work is in ethnic studies. It's about creating and supporting holistic identities that are transformative. So I'm just really inspired by the fact that the way in which they demonstrated what this looks like, and looking forward to the Q&A that's going to follow this.
And I would also extend that Julia, in thinking about the how, why, and the what slide that you offered, she used and was able to lean on those who came before to form anew. And this is Julia's framework, right? And I think that that framework provided a process to synthesize with students to make that meaning with each other, and then draw back on in their reflections within the journal. And so going through that process, that is such a learning ability that also fuels from within, and that they have to, I have never seen decolonization as a process in ethnic studies until this framework. And Julia, in bringing that in the first year of building with students, that has been such a necessary radical act of courage and love and radical care.
And so also just, cognizant of time, and, we know we've talked at you for a lot now. So we really want to hear from you all as well. So we'll kind of wrap this up and then move forward to the Q&A and the discussion that Brian has graciously put the link to there. And so we'll go to that Zoom room, which will be more conversational following this. But so Becca, if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So then just a quick recap, right? So we have shown you some elements. What Julia and Victoria shared was all specifically in the context of their ethnic studies classroom, right? But some of the other examples you've seen were not in ethnic studies classes. And so these ethnic studies pedagogies don't have to only happen in ethnic studies classes, right? They are all pedagogies that center student community voice, right? Particularly for communities of color. But again, these are not just pedagogies for students of color, right? For students in poverty. These are pedagogies for everyone, because everyone deserves this rich, deep understanding of our history and our systems and our institutions, right? They're grounded in collective humanization, right? So again, they're not just for historically marginalized groups, they're for all of us, for our collective humanity, because all of us require some healing, some dreaming, and some action, so we can live and grasp that freedom that we're striving for. Next slide, please. And we've put our references and some resources, some kind of free online links that are at this URL, right? That is case sensitive, so please note that, right? But so this is a Google Doc, and we can keep updating it as well. And then the slides have already been shared in the chat, and they'll also be available with the recording. And then last slide, please. So as we move to the discussion, so we're open to whatever questions you bring, right? So you don't have to confine yourself to the questions here, but we thought by way of offering some initial structure, right? If we really want to offer a space for really practical implementation type questions, we can think about frameworks that inspire you and your own curriculum design, how they might line up with these hallmarks of ethnic studies. What opportunities do you find for centering students in their communities, for knowledge co-construction? How might you co-design digital journals, right? And to what extent could you anticipate kind of rolling stuff like this out into your classroom? And certainly, what can you teach us, right? What are you doing in your classroom that also sort of embodies some of these hallmarks? And we also want to continue to learn. So yeah, we look forward. Thank you again for sharing your time with us, and we look forward to hearing from you in the discussion Zoom.
I remembered to unmute. Yes, we look forward to seeing you all in the discussion room. If you choose to attend, the link is there. There it is. The link is there in the chat. And thank you so much to our amazing presenters. Such a wealth of information and also practical application, a teacher's best friend, right? Both parts coming together.